All right, welcome APUSH students to Chapter 5 information here. Basically, we are talking about the government uh, post Articles of Confederation up until and through John Adams' presidency. All right. We've got some issues. You know, it was one thing to win the war, it's another thing to govern this new country full of 13 states that once viewed themselves as completely sovereign. Land is very sparsely populated. It's mostly trees, a lot of that. Only 4 million people, but that population did double every 25 years, which is good for us. We need a bigger population. There are only 6 cities with over 8,000 people in the 13 states. Philadelphia is the largest with 42,000 people. The sanitation of these cities is very poor, which leads to a lot of disease. Trans Appalachia, which is this area here, that means west of it, basically across. Trans means across. And only 5% of the population lives there. That's your frontiersmen, concentrated in these new territories of Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. Now, plenty of difficulties to travel and communication because the roads sucked. And, you know, it took 2 days to get from New York to Philadelphia. Most Americans are going to live near water passages because they are the highways of the ancient world. Westerners depended on the Mississippi River for travel through New Orleans. But of course, as we know, Spain controlled New Orleans, and so that's an issue. These are all things coming from the Treaty of Paris. Britain does not give up their forts in American territory like they were supposed to. And both the British and the Spanish are giving money and weapons to the Indians. Nobody's taking us seriously at this point. We've won the war, but we have many new problems that we're facing. We got to pay off those debts. We need a national defense against Indians. A census needs to be completed to determine how many representatives for each state. We got to organize new territories in this huge new land that we got from the Treaty of Paris. We got to create courts. We got to regulate the trade. We know the states are having some trade issues with each other. We got to establish diplomatic and commercial relations with Europe. It's all about the economy. We got to get in there with Europe and fix things. And we got to create an executive branch infrastructure because the Articles of Confederation simply weren't strong enough. Now, Washington wins unanimous approval from the Electoral College. John Adams becomes his vice president, and Washington builds his tremendous prestige to build a very strong chief executive. Now, he paid attention to the image of the presidency. He wanted it to be dignified and important to the world. It was actually, you know, they when addressing the president, we now know you say Mr. President. They had a lot of fancier ideas, and he really wanted it to be simple and came up with Mr. President. His cabinet was one of the greatest that America's ever seen, in my opinion. Secretary of Treasury was the very talented Alexander Hamilton. He had an awesome Secretary of War with Henry Knox, a Revolutionary War hero. Secretary of State was the genius Thomas Jefferson. Attorney General Edmund Randolph. And again, Washington is going to allow a lot of power to Congress. He doesn't fight that. Remember, he's not a king, doesn't want to be a king. Now, to make this new Constitution work, it's going to take a Bill of Rights. Many states and anti-federalists only supported the Constitution with the understanding that it would be amended to protect individual rights, that they would have these 10 Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. James Madison wrote and ensured the passage of the Bill of Rights. So there's his importance. He'll be another Virginian president. He'll follow Thomas Jefferson. It included freedom of religion, of speech, press, assembly, the right to petition the government. Number 2, the right to bear arms, a trial by jury. It prevented cruel and unusual punishment and the seizure of private property. Of course, most of these were injustices given to the colonies at the hands of the British. The Ninth Amendment declares specifying rights does not eliminate rights, not names. It's awful confusing. And the 10th basically says anything not given to Congress is given to the president. All right, the Judiciary Act of 1789, it's the same year the Constitution's ratified, set up a court system for the United States, a Supreme Court with 3 circuit courts and 13 district courts, 1 for each state. John Jay was named the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So that will be the Jay Court, is how anything under his leadership would be classified as. The U.S. Attorney and U.S. Marshal created positions were created to serve as prosecutor and police. The meanings of federal law, treaties, conflict between states and federal laws would be heard in the district court. And this ensured federal judges have final say over the Constitution. A law is either constitutional or it is not a law. Now, Hamilton's financial plan is really important. It's certainly something that there's going to be a lot of questions about. Now, Alexander Hamilton favors a very strong central government. He's certainly enamored of the British. He wanted an economic system favorable to the wealthy people. He is elitist. He thought that this would encourage investment. He's one of the early guys with the trickle down effect. If you take care of the wealthy, they'll sort of take care of the poorer people below them. That's the trickle down effect, supply side economics, if you will. The United States had significant national and state debt at this time, and some of the states didn't want to pay back to private creditors because they thought that it was wrong to profit from the war. Private creditors are people, individual people who loaned money to, say, soldiers and stuff. Speculators bought bonds from the original owners. Hamilton wanted to pay off the debt so that bankers, merchants, the wealthy would support the new government because they would make a lot of money. There's a financial incentive for them. He has this report on the public credit in 1790. The U.S. national government should pay all debts, state and national. Hamilton thought that the assumption of state debts would tighten the link between these 13 states and this new national government. Some states had already paid debt, however, and opposed assumption. Virginia is one of those states that has already paid their debt, and so now they're kind of ticked off that the other ones who held out are being rewarded for not doing what they should have done, which was pay off their debts. Now, Virginia will agree as long as the new capital of the United States of America was put on the Potomac River. Hamilton doesn't care. That's fine with him. He just wants to build the national credit. Our first capital was Philadelphia. Then we had New York. But to get his financial plan passed, Alexander Hamilton is going to have to give the new capital to the South. Many Southerners are against his plan, and having the prestige of the new capital, which will be called Washington, D.C., of course, after George Washington, and it will be built basically from scratch. They want that prestige, and so that's the only way they're willing to pass his financial plan. Make sure you know it. His report on a national bank. Hamilton is a big time, what we call the BUS, Bank of the United States. He wanted a national bank to be jointly owned with private stockholders. The bank would serve as a way for the government to collect taxes and provide a safe place to keep the nation's money. It would also lend the government and businesses money when they needed it. It would create a new paper currency for the United States. Unfortunately for him, Jefferson and James Madison both opposed the bank. They wanted the country to be based on farmers, not merchants and bankers, said that the bank was unconstitutional. Now, this is called Jefferson's agrarian vision. See, Thomas Jefferson believes that America should be farmland, that the vast majority of people should be farmers, and that we have this relationship with Europe. Europe will buy our food and we'll buy products from Europe. Now, Hamilton thought creating national debt was good. It would create financial incentive for wealthy investors to see the U.S. succeed. His reports on manufacturers and gives us a revenue tariff. Hamilton wanted tariff to raise revenue. So tariff, we're going to tax goods coming into America and to allow the growth of American industry. How that works is if we are starting to manufacture in America, but England's been doing it for a long time, which they have, they can get out cheaper goods to Americans than Americans can. So he wants to put a tariff on those goods so that Southerners buying something from England, it costs just as much as it does to buy it from the North. And that's going to be called the American system. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Hamilton created the excise tax on whiskey to raise money. He's doing everything he can to put money in the new national government. This whiskey tax, as it's known, is not going to make some of the frontiersmen happy. There will be a whiskey rebellion out there, but it'll be put down. This isn't Shays' Rebellion, where we don't know what to do. We don't have an army. We have an executive, and his name is George Washington. And he's going to march out there at the head of 12,000 men, and the Whiskey Rebellion will disappear real quick. And that shows the power of the new national government. And there was no bloodletting. There was nobody killed in it either. So the Whiskey Rebellion is sort of a coming of age for the new executive branch. Now, this is interesting, broad versus strict construction. What that means is we're talking about the Constitution. Strict construction is a Jefferson idea. You have to follow the Constitution to the very letter. Broad means, well, sometimes the Constitution is vague, and we can interpret what it means. Jefferson says the Constitution doesn't mention a bank, and since it doesn't, the national government can't create a national bank of the United States. All powers not specifically given to national government were reserved for the states. The foundation of states' rights philosophy, and that one's going to haunt us for a long time, especially as involves with slavery. Now, Hamilton argued the government can do anything necessary and proper to run itself. This was a broad view versus, or a loose construction versus the strict construction of Jefferson. Jefferson and Hamilton obviously are on, the flip side of everything here. The Constitution was given the right to borrow money, regulate trade and currency, and both would be done by this new Bank of the United States. Hamilton argues for implied powers in the Constitution based on the elastic clause, which is in there, and the foundation for a strong federal government. Washington actually sides with Hamilton on this one, and he signs the bank bill into law with a 20-year charter, meaning that in 20 years, and this will come up, in 20 years, the bank has to reapply for a charter or it dissolves. So Washington, who hates politics, doesn't want to get involved. He has to make that decision, and he goes ahead and he's convinced by Hamilton. Now, there's a rise of political parties in this time period. Factions exist before parties. I mean, factions are just groups of people who tend to believe the same thing, right? You had the Whigs and Tories in Britain, and you had the Federalists and Anti-Federalists here in America. Factions are formed for an issue. Parties are permanent organizations. Political parties emerged in opposition to Hamilton policies. They're going to be led, of course, by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. So you have your two groups, Federalists, and you need to know the groups. Federalists are led by Alexander Hamilton. They are mostly Northern. They favored a strong central government and economic growth. Think factories in the North. They had little faith in the masses of people. They favored rule by gentlemen, people of means, and they supported England, and they feared this new French Revolution that broke out in 1789 because it was so bloody. Now, the Democrat Republicans are led by Jefferson and Madison. They're mostly Southern. We already see this sectional division. Disliked cities and factories. They doubted wage workers had economic or political independence to maintain Republican ideas. They also preferred smaller populations where people knew each other. They believed America would provide food for Europe, and Europe would provide manufactured goods in return. They feared a strong central government, and they supported France. So as you can see, they're almost opposite in everything. Washington hates political parties and wanted governors to be guided by their patriotism to their new country. That's how George Washington sees the world. He felt that organized opposition to the government, such as these political parties, seemed unpatriotic. And so he doesn't want to get involved with it. Now, French Revolution, America has to kind of pick a side because of trade. And they decide that it would support France, which makes sense if you think about it. France had supported us in our revolution, and the French Revolution is based off of many of the ideas of the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson helped write parts of the French Revolution for them. Many saw it as a continuation of the ideals of the American Revolution. Some Federalists opposed the leveling aspects of revolution and mobocracy. Leveling means that it's an even playing field, that the noblemen are brought down in France. The mobocracy is ruled by the mob. They favor Britain instead of France due to the economic and political concerns. They feel like there's such a huge trade with Britain that it would hurt our economy if Britain turned on us. In 1792, France invaded Austria to spread the revolution and became a republic, which made France more popular in the United States, of course, because we were a republic. In 1793, however, the Reign of Terror shifted American opinion away from France. We're sitting over here saying it's gone too far. The French Revolution is far more liberal, it's far more violent than the American Revolution, and it turns many Americans off. Now, the Proclamation of Neutrality always finds its way into test. Britain is dragged into war with France as the revolution spreads through Europe. The Franco-American Alliance, way back in 1778, pledged that America would help defend the French West Indies. Democrat Republicans and Jefferson were eager to support France, But Washington did not believe the U.S. could survive a European war economically, militarily, or politically. He was supported by Hamilton. They needed a generation of peace for the United States to grow strong enough to compete with Europe. I tend to agree with him. So the U.S. declares neutrality under Washington. This fed into the U.S. tendency towards isolation from European affairs. This allowed U.S. merchants to trade with both sides in the war. And America took over Caribbean sugar islands to help with some of their money. Citizen Edmond Genet was an ambassador from France, and he tries to provoke America into a war with Britain. They really want America. I mean, I get it from their point of view. Part of the reason the French Revolution happened is that France went broke supporting America in the American Revolution. Genet tries to start a Canadian revolt against Britain and raise an American army to fight Spanish Louisiana and Florida. And problems with France created major divisions between American political parties. And Edmond Genet will not be allowed back into France because he would die. They would kill him there. Here's the Whiskey Rebellion I mentioned a little bit earlier, because the government puts a tax on the whiskey. It happens in southwestern Pennsylvania from the farmers out there. Whiskey was not only a commodity, but a medium of exchange. What that means is whiskey was cash money, baby. Cash money. And you could pay for a horse with whiskey barrels. They protested using similar techniques as used as Sons of Liberty in 1765 and Shaysites, those people in the Shays Rebellion in 1786, guerrilla warfare, that kind of stuff. Liberty, equality, fraternity was inspired partially by the French Revolution, that saying, that motto. But Washington stops the rebellion with his militia, and it proved that the national government was strong, unlike in Shays Rebellion. That's the most important aspect. That this time the federal government was able to respond to this crisis. Now, Britain refused to give up its forts. Thanks, Britain. They wanted to continue the fur trade in the Great Lakes, build an Indian nation as a buffer with Canada. Britain wanted to starve the French West Indies with a blockade. So Britain stopped American ships in the Caribbean and impressed, that word, you need to know it, or imprisoned American sailors. They were kidnapping American sailors and forcing them to work on their own in their navy. The French expected the United States to help defend French West Indies. We signed a treaty after all. Many Americans argued for war with Britain, but Hamilton wanted peace with Britain to protect American trade. So you can kind of see this from both sides. There's sort of the honor thing with going with France. Hamilton's more of the it makes a lot more money sense to side with Britain. We eventually get the Treaty of Greenville. The British were supplying weapons to the Miami Confederacy, led by an Indian named Little Turtle. And the Miami were successful, beating Generals Harmer and St. Clair. But we send in General Mad Anthony Wayne, and he beats the Miami Confederacy at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And in this one, the British refused to protect the Indians. And so we get the Treaty of Greenville, where the Indians agreed to allow settlement in the Ohio Valley in exchange for money and recognition of other lands. Jay's Treaty, he gets busted a little bit for this. He gets some public criticism. Chief Justice John Jay was sent to London in 1794 to make a treaty. So he's the Supreme Court justice guy. He's the main one in the Supreme Court. But he's unable to get Britain to agree to much. England doesn't agree to leave forts in the Northwest. Britain does agree to pay for seizure of ships. Oh, I'm sorry, doesn't. They did agree to leave forts. Unlike it's the second time they say they're going to leave the forts. Britain agrees to pay for the seizure of the ships. Britain refused to stop future impressments or seizures or selling of arms to Indians. Britain also got the United States to commit to repaying all the debt from the Revolutionary War to Britain and to Loyalists. Many of the public were angry about the treaty, and it strengthened Jeffersonian Democrat Republicans. The treaty was seen as a betrayal of the South and surrender to Britain because the South would pay the debts while North gets repaid for lost ships. Again, sectional issues here. We get Pinckney's Treaty with Spain. A lot going on right now, obviously. Spain feared the United States getting closer with England and not with Spain. So they offered a treaty giving the United States almost all that the United States wanted. They gave the U.S. access to the Mississippi River. They agreed to a border between Florida and the United States and the right of deposit in New Orleans. That was a big one. The U.S. could use New Orleans as a cargo transfer port. The effect of Jay's Treaty, Pinckney Treaty, Greenville Treaties created a sense of security for America. It recognized the borders of America. And most importantly, for a little bit anyway, while we got our feet wet, It kept us out of European war until we could grow a little bit stronger. Now, poor Washington, he's had his fill after 2 terms in 8 years. Washington refuses to serve a third term. On his way out, he gives his farewell address, which is very famous. He warns against sectionalism, this North versus South issue. He sees it as unpatriotic, and secession, that any of the states should leave the Union. He warned against political parties. He warned the United States should avoid entangling alliances with other countries. He favored temporary alliances, not permanent ones, because Europe's crazy, and he knows it. All right, the election, who's coming next after Washington? Hamilton made too many enemies putting his financial plan in place to be a viable Federalist candidate. So while he is very talented and certainly could do the job, he's just made too many enemies. Now, John Adams is also a Federalist, very qualified, but he's not really popular. He's got a rough personality. He was suspected to favor a more monarchical type of government, and Hamilton and Adams hated each other, which divided the party. Thomas Jefferson, he led the Democrat Republicans. He used the Whiskey Rebellion and Jay's Treaty against the Federalists to make them look bad. We already have mudslinging going on in these campaigns. Very nasty early campaign here. But Adams wins, and Jefferson comes in second. So he, in this odd twist of fate, he becomes the vice president. You can see that Jefferson won 68 of the electoral votes, and John Adams won 71. So it was an incredibly close election. This is what you have to know with John Adams' single term that he served is the XYZ affair and the Alien and Sedition Acts are really the main two things. So France was upset by Jay's Treaty. So they started seizing U.S. ships, and they didn't accept the U.S. envoy to France. We sent somebody over there. We want to talk to the French king, and they just leave him hanging. This is something known as the XYZ affair. When Adams sends 3 diplomats to improve relations with France to meet the French foreign minister Talleyrand, the 3 French officials demanded a bribe. It's something like $200,000. It's a ridiculous amount, and a loan for the privilege of talking to Talleyrand. American ministers refused to pay it and returned home. It's just a bad deal. They named the 3 diplomats X, Y, and Z, and so we've been offended by France. So we get a quasi-war, an unofficial war with France for a couple years here. U.S. prepares for war. The Navy Department is created for the first time. The Marines are reinstated from the Revolutionary War. The U.S. canceled all treaties with France. Hostilities remained in the West Indies, and both sides began seizing ships. In the Convention of 1800, France had been fighting most of Europe. Napoleon took his power, he's emperor at this time, and wanted peace. The Franco-American Treaty was ended, and the U.S. agreed to pay debts to France. There's those nasty Alien and Sedition Acts. Federalists passed laws to minimize the influence of the Jeffersonians. The Alien Acts increased the residency requirement from 5 to 14 years. Again, this is because he had very thin skin, John Adams did, and a lot of the people criticizing him were new to the country, and so he doesn't want them as citizens. The president was given the power to deport foreigners in peace or wartime. That's a lot of power. The Sedition Act was anyone who impeded the policies of the government or falsely defamed government officials, John Adams, including the president, could be fined or imprisoned. And Adams is using this to silence his critics. And it turned many people against the Federalists because they see the Federalists as being tyrannical here. Which is a big reason why he's not going to get a second term. Now, Jefferson is freaking out. He's fearing that more constitutional rights are being lost and that there's the fear of the establishment of one-party dictatorship, in this case, the Federalists. So Jefferson wrote the Kentucky Resolution, and Madison wrote the Virginia Resolution. Individuals could be jailed under the Alien and Sedition Act. A legislature had more freedom to criticize the government. These resolutions also explained the states' rights position. The Democrat Republicans argued the United States was compact or agreement between the states and national government. And since federal law exceeded constitutional powers, states had the right to nullify the law. So Jefferson goes even further than Madison, and he says that if a law exceeds constitutional powers, remember he's a strict constructionist, that a state had the right to nullify the law and say, nope, we're not following it because it's not just. Federalists argued that the people, not the states, had created this compact of government, and only the Supreme Court could nullify a law. No other states adopted similar resolutions as Virginia and Kentucky did. All right, here's your Federalists versus Republicans. I don't really want to read through all of that, but you probably need to take a second and just get a feel for it. Democrat Republicans, of course, tend to be anti Federalist, and Southern and Western and middle class people liked it. They don't want a strong central government, and they want the bulk of the power in the states, and they're agrarian oriented. And the Federalists are opposite of that. Okay, that's it. It's complicated. There's a lot going on there. There's a lot of things you have to remember, and that's why this PowerPoint lays out all the big time topics that you need to know for this section. It is a lot. Note card it up if you have to, but you've got to get familiar with some of these terms. All right, thanks guys. I'll see you in class.